The purpose of this video is to develop the dynamic aggregate demand curve. So we're going to draw a map, and the map starts from current inflation, pi, to aggregate demand. Now, what's in between here is monetary policy, which is created by the Fed, and that will shift R, the real interest rate, up or down, and that'll cause aggregate demand to shift up or down. Aggregate demand recalls consumption plus investment plus government expenditures plus net exports. So how do we get from current inflation, which is the current inflation rate, to the aggregate demand curve and the dynamic aggregate demand curve? Well, we have to make two stops. We have to look at two other curves to be able to derive the dynamic aggregate demand curve. First, we got to look at the aggregate expenditure curve, which sounds a lot like the aggregate demand curve, kind of looks like it, but it's a little different. It's the aggregate expenditure curve. And then what we have to do is we have to look at the monetary policy reaction curve. And that's where the Fed comes in and interacts with the economy to drive aggregate demand. So now let me first get into the aggregate expenditure curve. Now let's graph the relationship we want to talk about here. So we got the real interest rate, we have output. Think of that as supply. We have a downward sloping aggregate expenditure curve. We know there's a negative slope. As all semester, we've been talking about how an increase in interest rates reduces consumption and investment and so on. In other words, it reduces aggregate expenditures. Now, where is this curve located? Is it over here? Is it up here? Is it down here? Well, it's here because what anchors it is the natural long real interest rate and YP, potential GDP, where all the factors that go into the economy are being used at a normal rate. There's no stress in the economy. So we end up right here at an equilibrium. Right at this point is where supply, right here and along this axis, equals demand. Because think of aggregate expenditures as demand at this point. In other words, the aggregate expenditure curve shows us that the natural real rate of interest is the interest rate that is consistent with a long-term equilibrium in aggregate expenditures and output, specifically potential output, YP. Now you might ask, well, how does the economy grow? Typically how the economy grows is YP increases slowly over time. The amount of goods and services that can be produced in the economy, the potential of the economy at full employment, it grows. It grows because we have little increases in population over time, and so that's going to increase the full employment output. And it also is due to labor productivity increasing, so we can get more output for the same amount of resources that are being inputted into the system. And so, okay, so supply increases a bit, and so does demand increase a bit over time. And so what you can end up having is you can have this real interest rate relatively constant over time as things just creep out. Under normal conditions, creeps out, creeps over, and we can keep, say, the real interest rate at around 1%. And let's say this is 20 trillion, and this could be 21 trillion as things grow over time. Okay, that's normal conditions. Now, let's ask ourselves what shifts. What are the shifters of aggregate expenditures? Well, the first one would be a change in optimism or pessimism on the part of consumers and people in the economy. And so if we're more optimistic, it's going to shift that curve out to the right. And so the curve goes out to the right with increase in optimism or decrease in pessimism if you want. Two, you have a change in wealth. And so when wealth goes up, we all feel a bit richer, then we're going to spend more, all else being equal. You and I will consume more. Businesses will invest a bit more because of that. Three, it's going to be a change in government expenditures, G. Well, if the government decides to increase expenditures for whatever reason, wants to pull us out of a recession, that's called fiscal policy, or just increase the economy or just grow the economy a bit, then that's going to cause the aggregate expenditure curve to move to the right. The other thing would be a shift in net exports. So basically, you could think of this as if foreigners like American goods more, for whatever reason, they're going to shift the aggregate expenditure curve because our net exports are going to go up here. And so what we just looked at here was optimism, which would change C and I, wealth, which would change C and I, and then you'd have G changing, and then you have net exports. All of these change unrelated. They're the source of the cause, or the cause of these changes are independent of a change in R. So remember, when R goes up and down, we move along the same old aggregate expenditure curve. And when things shift, these guys shift for reasons other than changes in real interest rates, the curve for aggregate expenditures shifts. So the way to think about this aggregate expenditure curve shift is to think at each and every real interest rate, including the natural rate, there is an increase in expenditures. Now, let's move on to the monetary policy reaction curve. So the curve looks like this. We have a real rate of interest here. We have inflation on this axis, and we have an upward sloping monetary policy reaction curve. I'll call it curve 0 for now. And this curve, where is it located? It's anchored so that it crosses where R star, the real long-term interest rate. Now, I should be careful. It's a long-run interest rate. It's not associated with long-term bonds. It's actually a short-term interest rate. But this is where the economy gravitates towards in the long run. Let's just say it's 1%. And that's not unrealistic in today's world. It might be a little lower, but let's just use 1%. So this monetary policy reaction curve is anchored where the long-run real rate of interest intersects with the target inflation rate set by the Fed, which is about 2%. So we saw this when we covered the Taylor equation, and we looked at how the Fed reacts to inflation. And so one of the tricky things about this graph is that we're looking at changes in inflation as driving R. So normally we were looking at things that were changing on this axis as causing things on this x-axis. It's kind of reversed because now we got changes in prices, which are inflation, on this axis. So that's a little tricky. You got to keep that in mind. So the source of the changes are going to be here normally. In a few minutes I'll change R, just making what we call an exogenous change in R, just an outside change. But for now, most of the action is going to happen with, look, what happens when inflation changes relative to its target. So let's look at what this line represents right here. When we are right at this point, right, you have to keep in mind that actual inflation, that's this guy, right? Actual inflation is all measured on this axis, is equal to 2%. And then inflation expectations have to equal 2% because, you know, people expect a certain amount of inflation. And if you're in equilibrium, actual inflation needs to equal expected inflation. And not only that, but here in the long run, it has to equal target inflation. So all of these things line up in a long run equilibrium consistent with this R star. So we're right at this point. Now let's see what happens when inflation goes up relative to 2%. So if inflation goes up over 2%, the Fed is going to start raising interest rates. It moves along this line and raises the real interest rate. If the Fed sets a 2% target and inflation starts to fall below, then it's going to lower real interest rates. It's not lowering and cannot change R star. So the central bank can't change R star. That's based on the structure of the economy and then, you know, the effects of exogenous or outside changes in consumption or investment or government expenditures. Those things change R star, the natural rate, but the Fed can only change the real rate, not the natural rate R star. So if this is 1%, the Fed raises interest rates, this R star stays here, and the Fed raises interest rates to a higher, 1.5% or something. And if rates come down, they're going to drop rates to 0.5%. So this is a policy tool. In fact, the Fed just in August of 2020 said that this is an important policy tool, but it hasn't changed it in a very, very long time. In fact, since it started with a target inflation rate, it hasn't changed it. It's kept it at 2%. But the way it uses it as a policy tool is it does what's called jawboning. It sets this 2% and it's anchored there. But then it says in its press releases to the public, it basically says, we're leaning towards an inflation rate of above 2%, or we're leaning at a rate below 2%, but they keep this target, this anchor target at 2%, and they jawbone and tell the markets, we're leaning a little bit this way, we're leaning a little bit this way, and that is enough to influence the markets. And then sometimes what you'll see in the press release is they have a symmetric. They're not worried about leaning in any particular direction. They just want to tell you that inflation can be slightly volatile around the 2%, which means they basically have a normal distribution around here. Most of the time it's going to be about 2%. Occasionally you'll go a little above, a little bit below, so you can think of a normal distribution as being there. So that's how the Fed uses that target. The important point is you change inflation, the Fed moves along this monetary policy reaction curve. So it's a reaction curve. The Fed reacts to inflation. Now, since we have it anchored on the long run interest rate and a target inflation rate, that means if the Fed changes its target, or somehow this long run real interest rate changes in the economy, there's structural changes in the economy, or there's outside influences from consumption, investment, and government expenditures, for example, that could shift R. So now the question is, what happens to this monetary policy reaction curve when either of these two things change? That's what we want to look at. Let's look at a change in the target rate first. So we set equilibrium right here. We're in a long run equilibrium. Expectations, actual inflation, all match up. And the target match up. We'll set this at 1% just so we have a little better visualization of how it's working. And we're right here. Now the Fed increases the target inflation rate. Let's just say it goes up to 3%. The Fed changes this. The Fed can't change R star. So R star is constant, not changing. It's the structure of the economy. And all we're doing is we're changing a target. The Fed announces, literally comes out and announces a different target. That's what's happening here. So now they end up operating on a new monetary policy reaction curve. Because this is constant, so we're moving out in this direction, start out at 0.1, we end up at 0.2 with this new target inflation rate. And we're right here. Now, what does that mean? It now means the Fed is moving on a new monetary policy reaction curve. And when inflation starts going below 3% here, inflation starts going below 3%, it's going to start lowering interest rates to spur the economy. If inflation goes above 3% now, they're going to start raising interest rates to slow down the economy. And we know that when interest rates change and the Fed changes interest rates, it's changing nominal interest rates, which will change consumption and investment and net exports. We know, for example, that if the Fed changes I, it leads to a change in the real interest rate, all else being equal, which means if the real interest rate goes down, that means interest-sensitive consumption will go up. That means people will buy more washer machines and cars because the cost of credit is now cheaper, so they'll consume more. They'll also buy more houses, which is part of investment, and businesses will expand investment because it's cheaper to borrow and expand. And then also net exports minus imports will go up. This whole thing will go up. Why? Because when interest rates fall, the dollar will fall, which means our exports will go up because foreigners will find it cheaper to convert their foreign currency into dollars because the dollar fell. Remember the foreign currency story that we talked about earlier in this course. So exports will fall, imports will go down because of that. So exports go up, imports go down, the whole thing goes up unambiguously. And so a drop in real interest rates causes these reactions, and I don't want to model it now, but you know that that's going to affect aggregate demand because aggregate demand is made up of these aggregate expenditures here. But I don't want to get into that because we haven't developed the dynamic aggregate demand curve. So hold on to that thought. Now you ought to be able to reverse the whole process. And if inflation goes up, then the Fed's going to increase the real rate. And so how's it going to change the interest rate? Well, it's going to change the money supply. So it's going to restrict the money supply as we go up in this direction, which will cause interest rates to go up and all of this to go in the opposite direction. And if it increases the money supply, rates will come down, and then you'll see these changes as I've listed. Now, we have to look at what happens when we have a structural change in the economy and R star, the long-term or long-run interest rate, changes. Let me clean up the picture for you. Okay, so here we are, we're in equilibrium again. And now, let's say something happens in the economy that causes the real interest rate to decline. The natural real interest rate drops this way. Let's just say it drops down to, I don't want to drop it to 0 because that means we're going to hit the 0 lower bound, and we'll talk about that at another point in time. Let's just say we drop it down to 0.5%. And then what is going to happen? Well, the question is, should I keep it right here? Should I say we're just sliding down this monetary policy reaction curve? The answer is no, because inflation hasn't changed. The only time you slide up and down this is when inflation changes and the Fed reacts to what's going on, to that inflation. That's not what we're doing. There's a structural change in the economy. The Fed has not changed its target inflation rate. So we have to be on this line if the Fed hasn't changed it. One change at a time here. All we're changing is R star. So that means we've got to be right here at this point. So there comes R star down. And so we end up on a new monetary policy reaction curve. And we go from point 1 to point 2. So real interest rates have to be coming down along with this in order to come up with a new equilibrium. So if we have a new equilibrium rate, and that's where the economy settles to, then this real interest rate has to settle to that number also, right here. So now you know when real interest rates go down, that's going to spur consumption, investment, and net exports. And so that's going to increase aggregate demand. We're not there yet. We're about to get there in a minute. So this is what you need to know with the monetary policy reaction curve. Now, let's move on to the dynamic aggregate demand curve. Okay, so let's draw that dynamic aggregate demand curve. Output here, inflation here, and it's a downward sloping curve. Now remember, it's aggregate demand, which is consumption plus investment plus government expenditures plus net exports, right? But then it's going to be called a dynamic aggregate demand curve because what's going to happen in this story is that the Fed is going to react to inflation changes. And when the Fed reacts to inflation changes, it changes the real rate, which changes these guys. So that's where the dynamic component comes about. So what happens is, if we're right here at this point, for example, and inflation goes up, then the Fed is going to raise interest rates to get rid of that inflation or reduce that inflation. We're going to move up this curve. If inflation drops, the Fed is going to lower interest rates. Lower interest rates are going to spur output. So there's a couple of things we want to keep in mind. This is the aggregate demand curve. It has inflation at this point. It's different than the aggregate expenditures curve because the aggregate expenditure curve just had these components. The aggregate expenditure curve had these components, but we had R on this. The real interest rate was on this axis. So this is a little different. Not only that, but the fact that we're dealing with something that's a little different than the regular standard aggregate demand curve you might find in basic economics. So in basic economics, you will often see in an introductory economics course, P as a price level here, not inflation. So this is the changes in the price level. They'll often have a price here and output here, and you'll have an aggregate demand curve, downward sloping. And there's two reasons for that aggregate demand curve be downward sloping. Is that because when the price level rises, your wealth in terms of your savings accounts goes down. And so when that goes down, people are going to demand less, and you start moving up this curve, you move this way. Another reason for the upward slope is if the price level increases, nominal interest rates increase as money demand increases. And that reduces consumption, investment, and so on. We move up and move us up along this curve when it sees higher price levels. So the important thing to keep in mind is, if you do recall this from a previous course, this aggregate demand curve was set based on a specific money supply. So there's a certain money supply out there, and that's what this was based on. Now, I don't expect you to know this particular model. It uses the price level instead of inflation. It looks very similar, but the differences are very subtle and important. And as you can see, the model up here on the right involves a story with money demand. In the dynamic aggregate demand curve that we're focusing in on this video, money demand doesn't play a role in developing this dynamic aggregate demand curve. You see this curve here, the dynamic aggregate demand curve? This curve, the location of it, and everything that moves along here is consistent with a particular monetary policy view. For example, the target inflation rate. So it sets it here. Now, if the Fed changes things and changes its monetary policy, it's going to shift this curve. So the Fed has the same money supply all along here. All along here, the money supply can change. It's the same monetary policy, the same policy the Fed has set, but it's changing the money supply in order to change real interest rates through that monetary policy reaction curve. It operates through that target inflation rate relative to the targeted inflation rate. So now, what shifts this dynamic, this whole thing, the dynamic aggregate demand curve? Well, C, I, G, or net exports, if they go up, it's going to shift this demand curve to the right. And obviously, if they go down, it'll shift it to the left. Now, what else shifts it? Well, we just saw a few minutes ago that the monetary policy reaction curve will end up shifting it. So if the real rate goes down, the long-term real rate goes down, that means the dynamic aggregate demand curve will shift out to the right. Or if inflation target goes up, the Fed is more tolerant of inflation, the dynamic aggregate demand curve goes up. So this makes sense because if interest rates come down, it's going to spur the interest-sensitive components here. That makes sense. And then if the target goes up, the Fed is more tolerant of inflation, then it's going to anchor itself relative to this target and then adjust interest rates accordingly. And that's more likely to mean, most likely going to mean it's going to lower real interest rates in the process. That's going to shift the aggregate demand curve out. And if we reverse this process, we'll move the aggregate demand curve to the left. So now we're at a point where, we can learn a little bit about what's going on in the economy with this aggregate demand curve, this dynamic aggregate demand curve. But we really need to superimpose a short-run aggregate supply curve to see what's going on, to make more sense of how the economy works, and then overlay on top of that potential GDP, that vertical line that we talked about at the very beginning of this presentation on aggregate supply and aggregate demand. So the next video will introduce the short-run aggregate supply curve along with potential GDP.